They say the loudest sound in the world is the silence from a phone that used to ring. For me, that silence had a name. Brendan, my son. It had been 8 months of that quiet. 8 months since I'd last heard his voice, a voice that had learned to curdle the word dad into something that sounded a lot like an invoice. My name is Arthur Corrigan. I'm 67 years old, and for 40 of those years, I was a foreman at the Port Sterling steel mill. I have hands that know the shape of hard work and a bad knee that knows the price of it. I live in the same small brick house I bought with my wife, Sarah, 30 years ago. The house where we raised him. Sarah's been gone 5 years now. Cancer. It was fast and it was cruel, and it took the color out of my world. After she passed, I thought Brendan and I would get closer. You think tragedy is supposed to be a glue. For us, it was a solvent. It started with the money, Sarah's life insurance. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to be comfortable. I gave Brendan half, thinking he'd be smart with it. An investment, a down payment on a forever home. He bought a BMW. He and his wife, Jenna, lived in one of those new condo developments on the other side of town, the kind with names like the Aspire or the Summit. Places for people who spend their lives pretending they're not from a place like Port Sterling. Brendan sold luxury cars to people just like himself. He wore suits that cost more than my monthly mortgage and spoke a language of commissions and quarterly bonuses I didn't understand. He was ashamed of me. He never said it, but you could see it in his eyes when he'd visit. The way he'd look at the worn spot on my armchair or the chipped paint on the kitchen cabinets. This house, the one built with overtime and calloused hands, was a relic of a life he was desperate to escape. The final break came on New Year's Day. He'd come over, alone, smelling of expensive cologne and impatience. He wanted another $30,000. He'd maxed out his credit cards trying to maintain a lifestyle for his clients. "It's an investment, Dad," he'd said, pacing my small living room like a caged animal. "You have to spend money to make money." I looked out the window at my 10-year-old Ford pickup. I looked at the photos of his mother on the mantle, and for the first time, I saw the rot that had set in. The entitlement, the casual disregard for the value of a dollar earned through sweat. I said no. His face went blank. The practiced charm, the salesman's smile, it all just evaporated. What was left was cold and ugly. "You'd rather just sit here and rot with your memories than help your own son?" He hissed. "The money I have is for me to live on, Brendan. What your mother left is gone. It's time you learned what that means." He just stared at me for a long moment. No anger, no pleading, just a chilling emptiness. Then he turned and walked out. The silence he left behind was total. I told myself it was for the best. Tough love. But as the months stretched on, the quiet began to feel less like a lesson and more like a verdict. I had been judged and found wanting. The father he had was no longer the father he wanted. I just didn't realize how far he would go to replace me. My 67th birthday arrived on a Tuesday in October. The air in Port Sterling had that sharp, metallic bite to it, the kind that promises an early winter. I spent the morning doing what I always do, drinking coffee, reading the paper, and trying to ignore the silence in the house. I expected nothing from the day, and that was fine. Expectations had a way of turning into disappointments. Around noon, a fancy courier van I didn't recognize pulled up to the curb. A young man in a crisp uniform brought a heavy, rectangular box to my door. It was wrapped in thick, matte black paper, tied with a silver ribbon. It felt alien on my worn-out welcome mat. "For Arthur Corrigan," the kid said, handing me the electronic clipboard to sign. There was no sender listed on the label, just my name and address. I took it inside and set it on the kitchen table. For a few minutes, I just looked at it. It was too elegant, too theatrical. It wasn't from my sister in Florida. She sent fruit baskets. It wasn't from anyone in the neighborhood. My curiosity finally got the better of me. I slid the ribbon off and tore the paper. Inside was a dark cherry wood box with a brass latch. I lifted the lid. Nestled in a bed of cream-colored satin was a bottle of bourbon. But it wasn't just any bourbon. It was a Pappy Van Winkle, the 23-year butt bowed. I'm no connoisseur, but even I knew what this was. This wasn't a bottle of booze. It was a collector's item. A legend. Something that cost thousands of dollars, if you could even find it. My heart sank a little. I knew, instantly, who it was from. Tucked under the satin was a small, thick card. I pulled it out. The handwriting was his, that sharp, confident scrawl. 2 words, "Happy birthday." Not Dad, Not love, Brendan. Just the two words, sitting there like strangers. A wave of emotions washed over me, confusion, a flicker of hope, but mostly a deep, gnawing suspicion. This wasn't an olive branch. An olive branch is a phone call, a text, an awkward knock on the door. This was a statement, a performance. It was a gift he knew, for a fact, that I couldn't accept. 3 years ago, my heart decided to throw a party I wasn't invited to. A major heart attack that the doctors called a widowmaker. I survived, but barely. The cardiologist laid out the new rules for my life in no uncertain terms. No salt, no stress, and absolutely, under no circumstances, no alcohol. My heart was a machine with worn-out parts, and a single glass of bourbon could be like throwing a wrench in the gears. Brendan had been at the hospital. He'd sat there, scrolling on his phone, while the doctor explained it all. He knew. Of course he knew. So what was this? A cruel joke? Was he trying to tempt me? Or was this his way of showing off a casual display of the wealth he'd acquired without my help? A way of saying, see, I don't need you. I can afford to give away a bottle of bourbon that costs more than your monthly pension. I closed the wooden box. The click of the latch echoed in the quiet kitchen. The bottle looked like a museum piece, all dark amber liquid and old-world lettering. It felt dangerous. It felt like a test. I pushed the box to the far end of the table, a dark, silent guest that had overstayed its welcome before it had even been offered a seat. The hope I'd felt a moment ago curdled into something that tasted a lot like fear. I didn't understand the game, but I knew, deep in my bones, that Brendan was playing one. The box sat on my kitchen table for 2 days. Every time I walked past it, it felt like it was watching me. It was a monument to the chasm between my son and me. He saw a status symbol. I saw a beautiful bottle of poison I couldn't touch. Keeping it felt wrong, like keeping a trophy from a war I didn't want to fight. Selling it felt transactional and dirty. On the 3rd day, I knew what I had to do. My next-door neighbor, Manny Garcia, was a man who deserved something beautiful. He and his wife, Elena, had lived in the house next to mine for 30 years. Manny owned the Corner Perk, a little diner downtown that was a Port Sterling institution. He was the kind of man who shoveled my walk in the winter, before I even had my boots on, who left a container of his wife's pozole on my porch when he knew I was feeling low. Since Sarah passed, the Garcias had quietly, without ever making a big deal of it, adopted me into their family. Manny loved bourbon. He didn't drink it often, but when he did, it was with a quiet reverence. He had a small collection of decent bottles he'd share with friends on his back patio during the summer, the sound of their laughter mixing with the chirping of the crickets. His 30th wedding anniversary was coming up. He and Elena were planning a small party, just a few close friends and family. A bottle like this, on a night like that, it would be an event. It would be shared. It would create a happy memory. That felt right. It felt like turning something cold and calculated into something warm and genuine. It felt like taking Brendan's power move and turning it into an act of friendship. That afternoon, I picked up the heavy wooden box and walked the 20 feet to his front door. He answered on the second knock, wiping his hands on his apron, smelling faintly of coffee and grilled onions. "Art, come on in, my friend. What's this?" he asked, his eyes wide as I held out the box. "It's an early anniversary present," I said, "and you can't say no." He opened it right there on his doorstep. His jaw literally dropped. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He lifted the bottle out of the satin like it was a holy relic. "Arthur, my God, where did you get this? This is the stuff of legend." "It was a gift," I said, deciding to leave out the part about who it was from, "but it's wasted on me. I want you and Elena to have it. Open it at your party. Share it with people who will appreciate it." He looked at me, then at the bottle, then back at me. He was overwhelmed. He tried to refuse, of course, said it was too much, but I insisted. Finally, a huge grin spread across his face. He wrapped an arm around my shoulders in a bear hug. "Thank you, my friend, thank you. We will make a toast to you and Sarah. It will be the highlight of the night." As I walked back to my own empty house, I felt a weight lift off my chest. The Trojan horse was gone. I had disarmed it. I had turned a symbol of my son's coldness into a symbol of my friendship with a good man. Before I closed my door, I looked back. Manny was still standing in his doorway, holding the bottle up to the afternoon light, the amber liquid glowing like captured sunlight. He looked so happy, so unsuspecting. I had no idea that in trying to do a good thing, I had just pointed a loaded gun at his heart. The thought that I was responsible, that I had personally handed him the weapon, would later become the heaviest burden of all. The sense of relief lasted less than 24 hours. The following evening, I was washing my dinner dishes, the house filled with the lonely sounds of clinking plates and running water. The old landline on the wall, a relic I kept mostly for emergencies, suddenly rang. The sound was so jarring it made me jump. Nobody ever called that phone anymore. I dried my hands and picked it up. Hello? Hey, Dad. Brendan's voice. It was so casual, so smooth, as if 8 months of silence had never happened. I leaned against the counter, my guard immediately up. Brendan, I said, my own voice flat. Just calling to wish you a happy birthday. A little late, I know. Things have been crazy over here. You get my gift? The question felt rehearsed. I could picture him in his sterile, minimalist condo, pacing on the gray hardwood floors. I got it, I said. It's kite a bottle. Only the best for you, Dad, he said, and the lie was so effortless it was almost impressive. Then he got to the point. His tone shifted, just a fraction. It became sharper, more focused, like a predator leaning in. So, what'd you think? Did you try it yet? Pour yourself a glass for the big day? There it was, an unnatural eagerness, a hunger for an answer that felt wrong. It wasn't just a son asking if his dad liked a present. This was something else. A knot of ice formed in my stomach. I made a split-second decision. I wasn't going to lie, but I wasn't going to tell him about Manny either. Not yet. You know I can't drink anymore, Brendan, I said, keeping my voice calm. The doctors were pretty clear about that. The other end of the line went completely, unnaturally silent. It wasn't the sound of a dropped connection or someone gathering their thoughts. It was a dense, heavy, loaded silence. A silence that was an answer in itself. I counted the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3, 4. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. The fake warmth was gone. It was flat, cold, monosyllabic. Right, he said. Another beat of silence. Well, he said, his voice clipped. Just wanted to check in. And he hung up. I stood there holding the dead receiver, the dial tone buzzing in my ear. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, panicked rhythm my doctors had warned me about. He didn't ask what I did with it. He didn't say, "Oh, right, I forgot. Sorry, Dad." He didn't sound disappointed. He sounded thwarted. The casual phone call suddenly felt like a confirmation, a pilot checking to see if the bomb he'd dropped had detonated. And when he found out it hadn't, he just aborted the mission. I put the phone back in its cradle, my hand trembling slightly. The kitchen, which had felt lonely a few minutes ago, now felt menacing. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper. I walked to the window and looked across the lawn at Manny's house. The lights were on. I could see the silhouette of him and Elena moving around in their kitchen. They looked so normal, so safe. The icy knot in my stomach tightened. What had I done? The question echoed in the sudden, deafening silence of my own home. I didn't know what the danger was, exactly. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I had taken a threat meant for me and placed it, lovingly, right into the hands of my best friend. The silent alarm in my head was screaming. The next morning, the world ended with a phone call. I was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee I hadn't touched, replaying Brendan's call over and over in my mind. I was trying to convince myself I was overreacting, that I was just a lonely old man seeing conspiracies in the shadows. Then the phone rang again. This time, it was my cell. The caller ID read Elena Garcia. My blood ran cold. I answered on the first ring. Art. Elena's voice was a choked, terrified sob. Art, it's Manny. Something's wrong. Elena, slow down. What is it? What happened? He just collapsed, she cried, her words tumbling over each other in a panicked rush. We were having breakfast, and he couldn't breathe. His heart, Art, the ambulance is here now. They're taking him to St. Michael's. I was already on my feet, grabbing my keys from the hook by the door. I'm on my way, I said, my own voice sounding distant and hollow. They asked me if he'd ingested anything unusual, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. The paramedics, they said it looks like some kind of poisoning. The word hit me like a physical blow. Poisoning. It wasn't a conspiracy, it wasn't a shadow, it was real. The rest of the morning was a blur of fluorescent lights and the sterile, antiseptic smell of the hospital. I found Elena in the waiting room of the intensive care unit. She looked small and lost in the oversized vinyl chair, her face pale and streaked with tears. I sat with her, holding her hand, murmuring useless words of comfort while my own mind screamed. A doctor finally came out to speak with us. He was young, with tired eyes that had seen too much. "Mrs. Garcia," he began gently. "Mr. Garcia has suffered a severe cardiac event, but it wasn't a typical heart attack. His system is showing signs of a powerful cardiotoxin, something that specifically attacks the heart muscle. We're doing everything we can to stabilize him, but we need to know if he consumed anything out of the ordinary in the last 24 hours. Any herbal supplements, new foods, anything at all?" Elena shook her head, bewildered. "No, nothing. Just the same old Prody." Her eyes suddenly widened. She turned to me, her expression a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. "The bourbon," she whispered. "Art, the bourbon you gave us." I felt the floor drop out from under me. "He drank it?" "Just a little," she said, her voice trembling. "Last night, he was so excited. He wanted to try just a taste before the party. He poured a small glass, maybe an ounce. He said it tasted strange, a little bitter, but he just thought it was because it was so old and strong." The doctor looked at me, his eyes sharp. "What bourbon?" My mouth was dry as dust. I could barely form the words. It was a gift, a rare bottle, Pappy Van Winkle. I had to force myself to say the next part. It was from my son. The doctor's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. "We'll need to run a full toxicology screen. If there's anything left in that bottle, we need it. Now." I left Elena at the hospital and drove home in a daze. The familiar streets of Port Sterling looked alien, distorted. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. The image of Manny, holding that bottle up to the sun, so full of joy, was burned into my mind. I had been the delivery man. I had walked my best friend to his own executioner and hadn't even known it. When I got to his house to retrieve the bottle, Elena had already called their son, who met me there. The beautiful wooden box was sitting on their dining room table. But when we opened it, the bottle was gone. Elena, in her panic, had thrown it in the trash when the paramedics started asking questions. We found it in the bin outside, lying amongst coffee grounds and eggshells. It was almost full. That single, bitter ounce was all it took. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a bad batch. This was deliberate. This was an assassination attempt, and the bullet I had unknowingly dodged had struck the kindest man I knew. The rage that started to build in my chest was a cold, terrifying thing. It burned away the shock and the grief, leaving behind something hard and sharp, a purpose. I didn't take the bottle to the police, not yet. Going to the authorities with a wild story about my son, a car salesman, trying to poison me with a bottle of $1,000 bourbon, I sounded crazy even to myself. I needed more than a suspicion. I needed proof. I needed something undeniable, something that couldn't be explained away as a tragic accident. There was only one person I trusted to give me the unvarnished scientific truth. His name was Patrick Sullivan, but everyone at the mill had just called him Sully. We'd started on the factory floor together 40 years ago. While I went into management, Sully found his calling in the mill's quality control lab. He had a brilliant, curious mind for chemistry. He spent his days analyzing the metallurgical composition of steel, but his real passion was toxicology. It was a morbid hobby, but Sully was a morbid guy. Now, he was retired and ran a small, independent lab where he tested soil and water samples for local farmers. He owed me a favor after I'd helped his kid get out of a jam years ago. I drove the bourbon bottle, carefully sealed in a plastic bag, out to his lab on the edge of town. It was a small cinder-block building that always smelled of ozone and damp earth. Sully was there, a big man with a wild mane of white hair, hunched over a microscope. "Sully," I said, placing the bag on his stainless steel counter, "I need you to test this, and you have to tell me exactly what's in it." He looked at the bottle, his bushy eyebrows rising. "Sweet mother, that's the holy grail, Artie. What's wrong with it?" "I think it's poisoned," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Sully's jovial expression vanished. He looked from the bottle to my face, and he saw I wasn't joking. He didn't ask any more questions. He just nodded grimly. "Leave it with me. I'll run it through the gas chromatograph. If there's anything in there that ain't supposed to be, I'll find it." The next 2 days were the longest of my life. I spent them at the hospital, sitting in the uncomfortable vinyl chair beside Manny's bed in the ICU. He was unconscious, hooked up to a web of tubes and monitors that beeped and whirred, a relentless soundtrack to a nightmare. Elena and I kept a silent vigil, our shared grief a tangible thing in the small, sterile room. Every beep of the heart monitor was a reminder of the poison flowing through his veins, a poison I had delivered. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. My phone rang late on the second afternoon. It was Sully. "Art, you sitting down?" he asked. His voice was flat, all business. "I am," I said, stepping out into the hallway. "This ain't no accident, and this ain't common stuff. The base is high-quality Kentucky bourbon, all right? But it's been adulterated with a significant concentration of an alkaloid called taxine." Taxine? The name meant nothing to me. "It's the primary toxin found in the yew plant," Sully explained, his voice low. "Specifically, from the seeds and leaves of the English yew. It's a potent cardiotoxin. It disrupts the sodium channels in the heart, leads to arrhythmia, cardiac arrest, the works. It's nasty, Artie, very nasty." My hand tightened on the phone. How does something like that get into a bottle of bourbon? I could hear Sully take a deep breath on the other end. "It doesn't get in, Artie. It's put there. This was a sophisticated extraction. Someone knew what they were doing. They managed to concentrate it and introduce it without significantly altering the color or smell of the whiskey. It would add a slightly bitter aftertaste, but someone drinking a 2-3-year-old bourbon might just assume that's part of its complex profile. This was deliberate. This was professional. This was meant to kill." The hallway of the hospital seemed to sway. Sully's words confirmed my worst fears, painting a picture even darker than I had imagined. This wasn't just a crime of passion. This was the work of a cold, calculating mind. A mind that had researched, planned, and executed a nearly perfect murder. "Thanks, Sully," I managed to say, my voice a hoarse whisper. "Artie, whatever you're tangled up in, be careful. This is out of my league. This is police business now." I knew he was right. I hung up the phone and looked through the small window in Manny's door. He was so still. A good man, a kind man, was fighting for his life because of a family feud he had no part in. The cold anger I'd felt before now crystallized into something else. It wasn't just about justice for Manny anymore. It was about stopping the monster who had done this. The monster I had raised. The time for suspicion was over. The time for war had begun. Grief is a fog, but a confirmed fact is a lighthouse. Sully's report cut through my despair and gave me a single, clear point of focus. I wasn't just a grieving friend anymore. I was a witness, and I had work to do. Before I went to the police, I went home. I walked into my quiet house and saw it not as a home, but as a crime scene. The kitchen table where I'd opened the box. The phone on the wall I'd used to talk to Brendan. Everything was part of a story that needed to be told, and I was the only one who knew all the chapters. I pulled out a yellow legal pad and a pen. My hands were shaking, but my mind was sharp. At the top of the page, I wrote timeline. I started documenting everything, my foreman's habit of meticulous record-keeping kicking in. New Year's Day, argument with Brendan. Last contact. The 12th of October, approximately 12:15 p.m. Bourbon delivered. No sender. The 14th of October, approximately 3 p.m. Gave bottle to Manny Garcia. The 15th of October, approximately 7:20 p.m. Phone call from Brendan. Asked if I drank it. The 16th of October, approximately 9 a.m. Call from Elena. Manny collapsed. I wrote down every detail I could remember. The look of the box, the exact wording on the card, the unnerving silence on the phone. Each memory was a piece of a puzzle, and when I saw them laid out in black and white, the picture they formed was terrifying and undeniable. Then I went to my old roll-top desk, the one that had been my father's, and pulled out the fireproof box where I kept the important papers. The deed to the house, Sarah's death certificate, my will. It felt strange, but I placed the legal pad inside. From now on, this box wasn't just for protecting memories of the past. It was for collecting evidence for the future. It was my own private case file. With the timeline clear in my head, I finally made the call. I asked for the detectives unit and was put through to a woman with a calm, no-nonsense voice. "Detective Rossi. My name is Arthur Corrigan," I began, my voice steadier than I expected. "I need to report an attempted murder." There was a short pause on the other end. "Okay, Mr. Corrigan. Who was the intended victim?" I took a deep breath. Me. 2 hours later, I was sitting in a small, bare interview room at the Port Sterling police station. The coffee they gave me tasted like burnt plastic. Detective Isabella Rossi was younger than I expected, maybe in her late 30s, with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She didn't look like a cop from a television show. She looked like a tired, competent professional who had seen the worst of people and wasn't easily surprised. I told her everything. I walked her through the timeline, starting with the New Year's Day argument. I told her about the bottle, my heart condition, my decision to give it to Manny. I told her about Brendan's chilling phone call and Manny's collapse. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, just looking at the notes she'd taken. "And you have a friend who tested this bourbon?" she finally asked. "Yes, Patrick Sullivan. He found a concentrated toxin in it, taxine." I spelled the name for her. She wrote it down without reacting. "Mr. Corrigan," she said, her tone professional but not unkind. "This is a very serious accusation to make against your own son." "He nearly killed my best friend," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "He thought he was killing me." "This isn't an accusation, detective. It's a fact. We'll need to take the bottle into evidence, along with a formal recorded statement from you and Mr. Sullivan. We'll send the sample to the state crime lab for confirmation. If your friend's analysis is correct, then we will have grounds to proceed." She stood up. "But I need you to understand something. From this moment on, you do not contact your son. You don't answer his calls, you don't respond to his texts. If he shows up at your house, you call 911 immediately. Do you understand?" "I understand," I said. "This man you're describing," she said, pausing at the door, "is patient and methodical. People like that don't give up easily. They just change their methods. Be careful." I walked out of the police station into the late afternoon sun. The world felt different. I had crossed a line. I had started a chain of events that I couldn't stop. For a moment, the weight of it was crushing. I had just set the gears in motion to potentially send my only child to prison for the rest of his life. But then I thought of Manny, lying in that hospital bed, fighting for every breath. The grief was still there. But for the first time since this nightmare began, it was joined by a sliver of hope. I wasn't alone in this anymore. The truth had an ally now. Detective Rossi's warning echoed in my head. Don't engage him. But I knew Brendan. He was arrogant. He believed he was smarter than everyone else in the room, especially his old man. If the police started sniffing around, he'd lawyer up and shut down completely. I had one last chance to get something from him myself. One last chance to hear a lie that could become a crack in his armor. I had to do it before the official investigation spooked him. It was a risk. But it was one I had to take. I knew I needed more than just my memory of a conversation. I went to a strip mall electronics store and bought a small, high-fidelity digital voice recorder. It looked like a fancy pen. The kid at the counter showed me how to use it. One click to start, one click to stop. Simple, foolproof. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in almost a year. I drove to his side of town. The condos at the summit were all sharp angles and glass, a collection of sterile boxes stacked against the sky. I parked my old Ford pickup between a Porsche and a Mercedes. It looked like a rusty old dog that had wandered into a cat show. I didn't call first. I wanted to catch him off guard. I took the elevator up to the 7th floor, the recorder in my shirt pocket, my finger resting on the button. My heart was a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. I wasn't afraid. I was focused. I felt like a man walking into his old workplace to disarm a piece of faulty machinery before it killed someone else. Jenna, his wife, answered the door. She looked surprised, then flustered. "Art, what are you doing here?" "I need to talk to Brendan," I said, my voice calm and even. Brendan appeared behind her. He was wearing tailored sweatpants and an expensive-looking t-shirt, the picture of casual wealth. When he saw me, his face went through a flicker of emotions, surprise, annoyance, and then a practiced, smooth mask of concern. "Dad, is everything okay?" He ushered me inside. The condo was immaculate, all white walls, chrome and gray furniture. It felt less like a home and more like a hotel lobby. "No, son, everything is not okay." I stood in the center of his living room, forcing him to look at me. I clicked the button on the recorder in my pocket. It's about Manny Garcia. Brendan's mask didn't slip. "Manny? What about him? Is he all right?" The feigned concern was flawless. "No, he's not all right," I said, letting the anger into my voice for the first time. "He's in the ICU at Street Michaels. He collapsed yesterday morning." "Oh my God," Brendan said, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "That's terrible. What happened?" "The doctors think he was poisoned." I let the word hang in the air between us. For the first time I saw a crack, just a tiny one, a flicker of something in his eyes. Not shock, not horror. It was something else, calculation. He was processing, analyzing, adjusting his strategy. "Poisoned?" he said, shaking his head. "How is that even possible?" This was my moment. "They're asking about that bottle of bourbon I gave him, the one you sent me." "The bottle?" he said, his voice dripping with synthetic disbelief. "What about it?" "I bought it from a private collector. It was sealed." I took a step closer. "They need to identify the exact batch for their investigation. I can't seem to remember the details on the label. My memory isn't what it used to be. Was it the one with the stag engraved on the bottle, or the one with the oak leaf?" It was a complete lie. There was no stag and no oak leaf. I was baiting a trap, testing to see if he would claim knowledge he couldn't possibly have unless he had studied that bottle intimately. Brendan didn't even hesitate. "The oak leaf," he said, his voice firm, authoritative. "Definitely the oak leaf. It's the rarer vintage. A real shame if something was wrong with it." "Got you." The absolute certainty in his voice was his undoing. It was the arrogant mistake of a man who believed he had all the answers. He had to prove he knew about the expensive bottle, that he was the kind of man who dealt in such things. He overplayed his hand. "Right," I said, my voice cold as ice. "The oak leaf. I'll be sure to let them know." I turned and walked toward the door. I didn't say another word. I could feel his eyes on my back. He knew he'd said something wrong. He just didn't know what it was yet. "Dad, wait," he called out as I opened the door. Don't go talking to the police without talking to my lawyer first. This could be a huge liability issue for the distillery. You don't want to get involved in that." He was already spinning, trying to control the narrative. I just looked at him over my shoulder. "It's too late for that, Brendan," I said. "I'm already involved." I walked out and didn't look back. In the elevator, my hand went to my pocket. I clicked the recorder off. My whole body was trembling, not from fear, but from the raw, potent adrenaline of victory. I had him. I had his lie, cold, clear, and recorded. It wasn't the final nail in his coffin, but I had just handed the police the hammer. The recording changed everything. When I played it for Detective Rossi the next morning, her professional calm finally broke. A flicker of grim satisfaction crossed her face. "The arrogance," she muttered, shaking her head. "It's always the arrogance that gets them." She explained that while the recording wasn't a confession, it was powerful corroborating evidence. It established his intimate knowledge of the bottle and provided a provable lie. Coupled with Sully's lab report, which the state crime lab had just confirmed, it was more than enough. "We have the warrant," she said, her voice all business now. "We're searching his residence, his vehicle, and his office this afternoon. Again, Mr. Corrigan, stay home. Stay away from him. We'll be in touch." The waiting was a unique form of torture. I paced the floors of my small house, every creak of the floorboards sounding like a footstep. I imagined the scene at Brendan's condo, the surprise, the feigned outrage, the slow, dawning realization that his perfect, curated life was being dismantled, piece by piece, by uniformed officers. My phone rang around 4 p.m. It was Rossi. "We found it, Art," she said. I noticed she had used my first name, in a locked tool chest in his garage. It's a full-blown workshop. Dried plant matter, labeled U, beakers, vials, chemical solvents, and a notebook. "A notebook?" I asked, my throat tight. "It looks like a journal. Handwritten notes on extraction methods, purity tests, and dosage calculations. It's meticulous, chillingly so." I sank into my armchair, the phone pressed hard against my ear. It was worse than I thought. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was a project, a hobby. My son's hobby was murder. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. The silence from Brendan was no longer just the absence of contact. It was the coiled silence of a snake getting ready to strike. The police had seized his phones and computers, so he couldn't call or text, but I knew it wouldn't stop him. The first message came 3 days after the search. It wasn't delivered by mail or by phone. I found it when I went out to get the morning paper. Tucked under my doormat was a single photograph, printed on glossy paper. It was a picture of my house, taken from across the street at night. My living room light was on, a warm, inviting square in the darkness. There was no note. There didn't need to be. The message was clear. I can see you. I'm watching. I called Rossi immediately. She sent a patrol car to take the photo as evidence and promised to increase patrols in my neighborhood. But I knew a patrol car couldn't sit there 24/7. That night, I didn't sleep in my bed. I sat in my armchair in the dark living room, watching the street. Every passing set of headlights made my heart pound. I was a prisoner in my own home. The second message came 2 days later. This time, it was a note taped to my back door. It was made of letters cut out from a magazine, like in a bad movie. You talked. You'll pay. The childish, almost cliché nature of it made it even more terrifying. This wasn't the sophisticated planner from the notebook. This was the rage he'd kept hidden, now bubbling to the surface. He was devolving. He was becoming more reckless, more dangerous. Rossi was furious. He's trying to intimidate a witness, she said over the phone. This is a felony on its own. He's getting desperate, Art, and desperate men are stupid. He's going to make another mistake. She was right. The mistake came the very next day. A courier delivered a small, insulated box to my house. Inside was a single, perfect-looking apple, a beautiful, shiny red delicious. Taped to the stem was a small typed note. An apple a day keeps the doctor away. Or does it? This time, I didn't touch it. I called the bomb squad. It felt like an overreaction, but I didn't care. They came, along with Rossi, and carefully took the box away. The lab results came back a few hours later. The apple wasn't poisoned. It was just an apple. It was a mind game, a psychological assault. He was trying to break me, to make me live in constant fear, to make me second-guess every move, every object, every knock at the door. He wanted me to feel as helpless as he now felt. I sat in my silent house, the place that had been my sanctuary for 30 years, and I realized it was no longer safe. The monster wasn't at the door anymore. He was in my head. The apple was a turning point, but not in the way Brendan intended. It didn't break me. It galvanized me. The fear was still there, a cold stone in my gut, but the anger was hotter. He had brought this war to my home, to my mind. He would not win. Detective Rossi used the escalating threats to put more pressure on the district attorney. They now had witness intimidation and terroristic threats to add to the attempted murder charge. The evidence was mounting, building a wall of facts around Brendan, brick by methodical brick. The biggest crack in his defense came from an unexpected source, his wife. Jenna had been silent since the search. I imagined she was in a state of shock, or perhaps denial. But Rossi, a shrewd judge of character, had a different take. She's scared of him, she told me, but I think she's more scared of going down with him. We just need to give her a safe way out. Rossi brought Jenna in for questioning. At first she was loyal, repeating the story that Brendan had bought the bourbon from a collector and knew nothing about its contents. But then Rossi laid out the evidence. The photos of the workshop in her garage, the notebook, the threats against me, and finally, she played her ace. We have subpoenaed your financial records, Jenna, Rossi said calmly. We know about the $500,000 life insurance policy Brendan took out on his father 6 months ago, the one where he is the sole beneficiary. That was it, the final brick. Staring at the proof that this wasn't just about resentment, but about cold, hard cash, Jenna crumbled. She began to talk. She told Rossi everything. She said Brendan's personality had changed after I refused to give him the money. He became obsessed, secretive. He spent hours in the garage at night. He told her he was starting a boutique herbal extract business. She admitted she knew he was buying strange plants online, that she'd seen the notebook, but she thought it was just a strange new hobby. She swore she didn't know about the poison or his plan. Whether she was telling the full truth or just enough to save herself, I'll never know. But she gave Rossi something invaluable. She gave her the password to Brendan's cloud storage account. That night, Rossi called me. Art, we're going through the cloud files now. It's a treasure trove. Search histories for odorless, tasteless poisons, calculating lethal dose cardiotoxin, how to bypass a police investigation. But there's something else. There are videos. Videos? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. They're tests, she said, and I could hear the disgust in her voice. Short clips. He's in the garage. He's injecting his extracted poison into pieces of meat. Steak, chicken breasts. Then he films them over the next few hours, documenting the discoloration and decay. He's got a whiteboard in the background where he's tracking the results. He was perfecting his method. I had to sit down. I closed my eyes and saw my son in his clean, organized garage next to his $60,000 car, meticulously practicing for my murder. He wasn't just a man who had given in to a dark impulse. He was a scientist of death, a student of my destruction. With Jenna's testimony and the digital evidence, the DA had an ironclad case. Rossi told me they were issuing a warrant for his arrest. He was officially a fugitive. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went down to the basement and opened my old steel gun safe. The hunting rifle I hadn't touched since Sarah got sick was still there, oiled and ready. I brought it upstairs and laid it on the coffee table. I didn't plan on using it, but I would not be a helpless victim in my own home. The police could build their walls of evidence around him. I would build my own. I sat in my armchair, the rifle on the table, the house dark, and I waited. The fear was gone now, replaced by a grim, patient certainty. This would end. One way or another, it would end. And I would be the one still standing when it was over. The manhunt for Brendan lasted 72 hours. 72 hours where every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside my window was him. I barely slept. I sat in my armchair, the rifle never far from my hand, drinking black coffee and watching the sun rise and set on a world that felt like a tinderbox. They found him in a cheap motel 2 counties over, paid for in cash. He didn't fight, he didn't run. According to Rossi, when they kicked the door in, he was just sitting on the edge of the bed, calmly packing a bag, as if he was just waiting for the inevitable. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a cold, quiet resignation. But the final, most devastating blow came after he was in custody. It came from the notebook. Rossi had asked me to come down to the station to look at it. She thought I might be able to decipher some of the shorthand or recognize a name. Sitting in that same sterile interview room, she pushed the spiral-bound notebook across the table. It felt profane in my hands. His familiar handwriting, the same handwriting I had taught him to form as a boy, filled the pages with chemistry and death. Most of it was technical data, chemical formulas, and temperature charts. But scattered throughout were coded entries, little notes on his progress. I flipped through the pages, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. Then I saw it, an entry from 3 months ago. Trial it, mg dose, 0,5 the subject, pork loin. Result, mild discoloration after fire hairs, potency inadequate, knees refinement. My blood turned to ice, mg. Manny Garcia. Rossi, I said, my voice hoarse. I pushed the notebook toward her, my fingers shaking as I pointed at the entry. MG, that's my neighbor, Manny. She looked at it, her eyes widening. He was planning this for months, she whispered. Manny wasn't an accident. He was always part of the plan. It all clicked into place. The expensive, impossible-to-get bourbon wasn't just a weapon. It was a delivery system designed to be passed on. Brendan knew I wouldn't drink it. He must have known I'd give it to the most likely person, the bourbon-loving friend I saw every day. Manny wasn't collateral damage. He was the test. He was the canary in the coal mine. Brendan was using him to see if the poison worked, how the doctors would react, how long it would take. If Manny had died quietly, if the doctors had ruled it a simple heart attack, then I would have been next. A few weeks later, another gift would have arrived. Something more direct. Something I would consume. As I sat there, stunned into silence by the depth of his monstrosity, I kept flipping the pages, a morbid curiosity pulling me forward. And then I found the last entry, dated the week before my birthday. It was different from the others, cleaner, more confident. Final calibration, AC dose, 1.5 milliliter, adjusted for known cardiac weakness. Subject, prime rib, result, rapid cellular necrosis, systemic failure in 90 minutes. Potency, optimal, A, C. Arthur Corrigan. He had rehearsed my death. He had bought a prime rib, my favorite cut of meat, the one Sarah used to make for my birthday every year, and he had poisoned it. He had watched it decay and timed its destruction. He had written my obituary in a code of milliliters and necrosis. I closed the notebook. I didn't have to see any more. The man who wrote those words wasn't my son. I didn't know what he was, but he wasn't the boy I had raised. The boy I had raised was gone, and this cold, meticulous killer had taken his place. I looked up at Rossi. The professional mask was gone from her face. She just looked at me with a profound human sadness. "I'm so sorry, Art," she said softly. The grief I had been holding back for weeks finally hit me. It wasn't grief for Manny, who was now slowly, miraculously recovering. It was grief for the son I had lost. I didn't break down. I didn't cry. An old steel man doesn't do that. But something inside me broke. The last thread of hope, the last microscopic possibility that this was all a tragic mistake, snapped. I stood up from the table. "He wanted to watch me die," I said, the words flat and empty. "Okay, let's give him what he wants. Let him watch me on the witness stand. Let him watch me bury him." The quest for justice was no longer just for Manny. It was for me. It was the only thing left to do. I would face the monster he had become, not as a father, but as a survivor, and I would tell the world exactly what he had done. The vengeance I felt wasn't hot and fiery. It was as cold and patient as the entries in his own notebook. The trial felt like a slow-motion car crash. Every day for 2 weeks, I sat in that courtroom and watched as the man who used to be my son tried to dismantle reality. His defense was audacious. His lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit, argued that the notebook was a work of fiction, the morbid fantasies of a frustrated writer. He claimed the workshop in the garage was for a holistic remedies startup that never got off the ground. He painted me as a vindictive, controlling father, jealous of my son's success and trying to frame him after a petty argument over money. It was a performance, and Brendan played his part perfectly. He sat there day after day, looking clean-cut and earnest, his face a mask of wronged innocence. When my recording was played for the court, his lawyer argued that he had simply been confused and flustered by my aggressive questioning. But the evidence was a mountain, and they only had a shovel. When I took the stand, I didn't look at Brendan. I looked at the jury. I told them my story. I kept my voice steady, my answers simple and direct. I talked about Sarah and about my heart. I talked about Manny, my friend, and the look on his face when I gave him the bottle. During the cross-examination, Brendan's lawyer came at me hard. "Mr. Corrigan," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "isn't it true you were angry at your son for being more financially successful than you ever were?" "No," I said calmly. "I was disappointed that he valued money more than he valued people." "And isn't it true," he pressed on, "that you threatened to write him out of your will if he didn't pay back the money you'd loaned him?" "There were no loans, only gifts. And the only threat to my will," I said, finally letting my eyes drift over to the defendant's table, "is sitting right over there." The moment that broke him, though, wasn't my testimony. It was Manny's broke. Manny walked to the stand slowly, with a cane he would need for the rest of his life. The poison had done permanent damage to his heart and nervous system. He was a shadow of the vibrant man he had been. He told the jury about our friendship, about his anniversary, about his excitement over the beautiful gift. Then the DA asked him how the bourbon tasted. Manny looked at the jury, his eyes full of a quiet, profound sadness. "It tasted," he said, his voice raspy but clear, like betrayal. Though I didn't know it at the time. After that, it was just a matter of time. When the jury filed back in after only 3 hours of deliberation, I knew. Their faces were set, their eyes grim. They refused to look at the defense table. The foreman, a woman who looked like a school teacher, stood and unfolded the paper. "On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree," she said, her voice ringing through the silent courtroom, "we the jury find the defendant, Brendan Corrigan, guilty." A gasp went through the room. Jenna, who had been sitting behind him, let out a choked sob. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I just felt tired, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion, as if I had just finished a 40-year shift at the mill. The judge sentenced him to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. 30 years. He would be an old man when he got out, older than I was now. As the bailiffs came to lead him away, he finally looked at me. The mask was gone. The calm, the arrogance, the feigned innocence, it had all been stripped away. What was left was pure, undiluted hatred. His eyes were like 2 black holes, devoid of any light or humanity. He didn't say a word, he just stared. And in that stare, I saw my final verdict. He would never forgive me for surviving. I walked out of the courthouse alone. Rossi gave my shoulder a squeeze as I passed. "You got him, Art," she said. I stepped out into the bright, cold afternoon. The world was exactly as I had left it, but everything had changed. Justice had been done. The monster was in a cage. But my son was gone forever, and that was a life sentence of my own. It's been a year since the trial. The quiet in my house is different now. It's no longer the heavy, waiting silence of a man bracing for the next attack. It's just quiet. It's the peaceful, unremarkable silence of a Tuesday afternoon. Manny is back at his diner. He moves slower, and his son does most of the heavy lifting now, but he's there, behind the counter, greeting his regulars with that same warm smile. We don't talk about what happened. We don't have to. Sometimes we just sit on his back patio in the evenings, watching the sunset, and the shared silence is more comfortable than any words could ever be. His friendship is the one thing that came through the fire, unburned. I received one letter from the prison. It was from Brendan. It was a single page, filled with his familiar, angry handwriting. It wasn't an apology, it was an accusation. He blamed me for everything. For his mother's death, for his own failures, for the life he now had. He said I had stolen his future. There was no remorse, no understanding of the horror he had inflicted. It was the letter of a stranger. I read it once, then I burned it in my kitchen sink and watched the ashes go down the drain. The fireproof box is back in my roll-top desk. It's filled with the old papers again, the deed, the will, the photos of Sarah. The yellow legal pad with my timeline is gone. I don't need it anymore. I know the story by heart. Sometimes, when I'm working in my small garden out back, I'll think of him. I'll think of the boy I taught to ride a bike, the teenager I helped with his homework. And I wonder, where did he go? When did the son I loved die, and when did the monster take his place? It's a question without an answer, a wound that will never fully heal. They say justice brings closure. That's a lie we tell ourselves to make the world feel fair. Justice is just a balancing of the scales. It doesn't erase the crime. It doesn't heal the scars. It just builds a wall between you and the thing that tried to destroy you. I'm safe now, but I'm not the same man I was. I look at the world a little differently. I see the darkness that can hide behind a familiar smile, but I also see the light. I see it in the kindness of a neighbor, in the integrity of a detective who listened, and in the simple, stubborn resilience of a human heart that refuses to stop beating. I survived, and in the end, that's a victory. It's not the one I ever wanted, but it's the one I've got, and it's enough.